So, I again just wanted to welcome you to part two of a two-part series on the origin of earthquakes. And last week we went over, and we're not going to really repeat, we went over all that the Bible has to teach about earthquakes. The Bible says, I'll summarize it this way. The Bible says there will be global earthquakes. The Bible says there will be global earthquakes to the point where every mountain will be moved, every island will flee away, every city will be destroyed, every wall will be knocked down, and the earth will reel like a top. We went over all the verses covering that. I mentioned last week that evolutionary plate tectonic theory would say that's impossible. So if evolutionary plate tectonics theory of what's causing earthquakes over, stresses building up over millions of years, etc. If that's true, we'll never have a global earthquake. But the Bible says we are going to have a global earthquake. And last week we said that this week we will cover a theory of how the flood of Noah occurred, that the causes of the flood of Noah and how the flood of Noah occurred scientifically would put us in a position where global earthquakes could and will occur. And then we're going to conclude today with, what holds up to the facts of biblical prophecy and the facts of science. So we went over the Bible verses last week, and then we tried to do a real quick look at what does evolutionary plate tectonics teach. We did that last week. We're not going to do it again except by a review, and the reason why we can review it is if anybody goes to the supermarket that sells National Geographic, you're going to see this. This is the special edition. And if you look at this fine print, it says leave this on the shelf till July 2010. So we've got, here it is, May 2010, and we've got the July 2010 edition. That's pretty good, pretty up to date. And they talk about all of Mother Nature's fury, all the things happening, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, fires, look at what's happening. And it's flying off the shelf. And fortunately, this provides just a little review for those that weren't here last week. The next slide, this is out of the National Geographic special edition. It shows the evolutionary mindset of what's going on in the inner earth, and you'll see those little arrows in the mantle. And see those little arrows right there? That's talking about these convective currents that are causing the crustal movements to occur, that over millions of years of very slow motion of these convective heat currents are causing plates that are on the earth to grind up against each other, and every once in a while the grinding snaps because of the stress buildup, snaps and gives us an earthquake. They say in here the earth, some 4.6 billion years ago, a dust cloud condensed to create our planet. That's what they say caused our planet. And by the way, there's no scientific support for that. Dust in space could not possibly, by the laws of physics, decide to condense to create an Earth. But that is their best guess of how the Earth got here, even though it's scientifically untenable. It is not possible. But that's what they say. Layers formed as it began to cool. Continual internal rolling moves heat to the surface for release. So this is their fairy tale. This is a fairy tale. They blame us for...
But at least we know it was exactly 4.6 billion.
Exactly 4.6. And I pity the poor sucker that says it's 4.7 billion years old, because they're wrong. By the way, if the Earth were 4.6 billion years old, it would be stable. There would be no earthquakes. And they'll say, and I'm going to go to some other quotes out of the National Geographic, they say there's some kind of nuclear energy down there. They never define how nuclear energy starts. In fact, nobody knows where the source of Earth's radioactivity. Everything that they say about the origin of Earth's radioactivity makes no sense scientifically. So there shouldn't be earthquakes by that map. Would you say there's earthquakes? Yeah, in 1 week, 1,354 on that map in the week. So another statement they make about the mantle: heat makes the rock in the mantle flow. Most comes from decaying radioactive isotopes in the layer itself. Where did they come from? They don't have an answer where the radioactive isotopes. They thought there was a reactor inside the Earth once, but they now know scientifically there isn't. And they don't even know that there is radioactive material in the mantle, but they assume it is because where does the heat come from? So they assume a lot of things. Contact with the core provides the rest of the heat. And then they talk about tectonics. Rigid slabs of rock called tectonic plates make up the Earth's surface. The underlying rock is viscous, circulating in vast convection currents that slowly grind the slabs against each other. And I want to say right now that these convective currents go deep into the mantle. See, this is the inner core. This is a liquid outer core right in here. And this is the mantle. And see, they're talking the mantle going all the way down to the liquid outer core. And what I'm going to make a big emphasis on today, because it is the key to our understanding the real source of earthquakes, is that 400 miles deep into the earth, in the shallow mantle, not deep in the mantle here, but shallow in the mantle, 400 miles deep, any rock that melts can only go down because its density increases, and it will never flow up. It can't, by the laws of physics and the new understanding of what happens to rock when it melts, when it's under the pressure of 400 miles deep, it is impossible by the laws of physics for that map to happen, for that explanation. It is false. It is a lie. Okay, so, and then earthquakes. When two slabs of crust crunch past each other, or one dives beneath the other, the ground shakes, sometimes violently. And that's a fact. That is, when plates are grinding. It's just what causes the grinding is what's going to change in our understanding tonight, I hope. All these statements by National Geographic are not supported by the facts, except, the earthquakes, the way they say the slabs are moving is not true. But there is movement, and we're going to explain what's really causing the movement. Not supported by the facts, but come from the wishful thinking of those telling the unscientific evolutionary fairy tale. And we, with boldness, can talk to our friends and neighbors about this when you're armed with this knowledge, which comes from Dr. Walt Brown's book, which we're going to explain here in a minute. So, part 2 tonight. That was the quick review. Hopefully that caught everybody up to speed that wasn't missed all last week. Part 2, today, May 12th, 2010. What causes earthquakes? And I'm going to be presenting that answer from the hydroplate theory perspective of the flood of Noah. And then we're going to look at which theory fits the evidence and what's consistent with biblical prophecy. And the teaching is based on a literal view of the Genesis account. Believe the literal, how the earth was created. It's based on the flood of Noah being a global cataclysmic event. There are some people profess to be Christians who think that the flood of Noah being global is a fantasy, and that the Bible is wrong or it's being improperly interpreted. And if you've ever carefully read the account of the flood, God said the whole world got flooded in about 5 different ways. It's like everything that on the earth that had breath in its nostrils died, except for what was on Noah's Ark. I mean, he made it emphatically clear. It was a global cataclysmic flood. And it's also based on Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which his website is at creationscience.com, and you can read all about how the flood of Noah occurred and the scientific support for it. This slide shows the 8th edition of his book, and Dr. Walt Brown, again, creationscience.com. So, because it's really important to get an overview of his theory to really narrow in on what we're going to talk about today. In 1993, there was a CBS special that featured an animation of Dr. Brown's theory of the flood, while CBS did a special on In Search of Noah's Ark. And so we're going to watch what was shown to millions of Americans in 1993 as just a quick summary of the entire hydroplate theory that will be the basis for then tunneling in, looking narrowly at the melting of the inner earth and when that happened, how it results in earthquakes on the earth today. The video I just introduced was used back in 2010, and it featured an animation and explanation by Dr. Walt Brown of the overview of his hydroplate theory, We're replacing that video that I introduced back then with a new one that's made by Mike Snavely of Mission Imperative. It goes along with our earthquake video in the sense that it gives updated information from Dr. Walt Brown that we thought would just help you to understand earthquakes with a greater awareness of Dr. Brown's theory. So hope you can go to missionimperative.org and see other products that Mike Snavely has. Thank you.
We can see on our planet many strange features that can now be linked together and systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood, whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 10 billion hydrogen bombs. This explanation shows how major mountains formed very quickly. It explains our coal, oil, and methane deposits, rapid continental drift, why we find on the ocean floor huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were rivers and seas. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 5,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, about half the water that is now in our oceans was originally in interconnected subterranean chambers. This water formed a thin spherical shell about 3/4 of a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the surface of the pre-flood Earth. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust, just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 2 miles a second. This crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in less than 3 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling crack, fountains of water jetted supersonically into and far above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rains, such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago that we can now tie together scientifically in cause and effect order. Some of the water jetting high above the stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the Earth. The sediments trapped and quickly buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Vegetation uprooted by the floodwaters accumulated in certain regions where it was buried and compressed, rapidly becoming our coal, oil, and methane deposits by processes we can duplicate in the laboratory today. Eventually, the rupture became so wide that the newly exposed compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles an hour, they ran into resistances and, like a crashing continental-sized train, compressed, crushed, and buckled. As the continents crushed and thickened, they rose out of the floodwaters. The portion of the hydroplates that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. This also explains why today's continents do not have the jigsaw fit against each other as so many textbooks mistakenly claim. Instead, the continents would fit much better against the base of the mid-Atlantic ridge where the continental drift began. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters eventually drained. This rapid continental drift and the resulting compression and buckling was so cataclysmic that it occurred within a single day. Immediately after the flood, sea level was considerably lower than it is today, so land bridges connected every continent. This allowed people and animals to spread over and repopulate the post-flood Earth. As the thickened continents slowly sank into the Earth's mantle, the new and very deep ocean floors had to rise in compensation for the downward flow of mass. Therefore, sea level rose slowly for a few centuries after the flood and eventually reached today's level. As sea level rose, river channels were drowned, channels that had been cut down to the lowered sea level by the heavy drainage after the flood. This explains the famous submarine canyons that are extensions of our major rivers, such as the Amazon, the Congo, the Indus, the Hudson, and the Ganges. Because some submarine canyons are almost 3 miles below today's sea level, we can conclude that sea level and some seafloors were about 3 miles lower than today. The rising sea eventually flooded the land bridges and produced the look of the continents as they appear today, separated by water. As the floodwaters drained off the continents, every continental basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes. Because of local conditions, some of these lakes simply dried up. Others continued to collect water from rainfall and drainage from higher elevations. Sometimes a large lake spilled over its rim at the lowest point, eroding a notch. If the rim wall was composed of sediments that were still soft, the escaping water quickly enlarged and deepened the notch. As the volume and speed of the escaping water increased, so did its eroding power, until the entire lake surged through a deep slit, forming a canyon. The largest canyon formed by this process is the Grand Canyon of Arizona. North and east of the Grand Canyon was a huge lake that I identified in 1988 and named Grand Lake. Its dumping released more water than is in all 5 of the Great Lakes. Grand Lake spilled over its rim and carved this spectacular funnel 20 miles south of Page, Arizona, catastrophically forming the Grand Canyon within a few weeks and leaving a living testament to this terrible global flood, which can now be studied in person today.
Since 1993, Dr. Brown has made other scientific observations and discoveries that have added to that. He was talking about the weight of the crust pushing down on the water, jettisoned it up 20 miles. We now know that the water actually reached supercritical temperature and came out explosively because of it being at supercritical temperature, and we don't have time to get into that. It not only went 20 miles up, it launched the comets into space. And there was tremendous energy. The reason why it heated up, all that other stuff we don't have time to get into, but it was explosive. If you would have been out in space, this is what it would have looked like on Earth when the fountains of the Great Deep burst open in one day. And this is what it says: in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the Great Deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So the water jettisoned out of this crack, and the water at the edge of the crack would have gone up with some velocity, but come down as just regular rain. Closer to the center of the crack, it would have gone up into space, but whatever goes up is going to come down, unless it's fast enough to leave Earth's gravitational attraction, which is several miles per second. But the stuff that went up into space came down, buried the mammoths while they're chewing on tropical vegetation still in their mouth, and they died standing up, crushed by all the ice that was coming down. And some was with enough to escape Earth's gravity, and they became comets, and some of the other debris became asteroids. But we're not here for that. But there was tremendous energy. Things have changed since the video that you just saw, but this is a fountain that would have been eroding the crack on each side. You know, the crack creates a side of the crust to the left, a side of the crust to the right. That water jettisoning from the subterranean chambers would have hydroblasted the edge of that crack, spreading debris all over the earth and up into space. So as the crack would have widened, and you know, looking at this picture here at first, when it first jettisoned, it's just a small crack. It would have cut away at the crust, making the crack wider and wider. Everybody kind of follow that concept? And ultimately, the crack would have been big enough that the mantle underneath the crust would have seen this as a low pressure area to spring up into. 10 miles below the Earth's surface, you're 60-some thousand pounds per square inch. Some people think as rock can't just bow up. But rock under that pressure is like a spring. Everything under pressure is like a spring. You know, you put steel under enough pressure and it's going to actually shrink molecularly. You're pushing the molecules closer together. You remove the stress, it's going to get bigger. So everything acts as a spring, and down that deep, the mantle would have acted like a spring and popped up. And this is known physics, actually. And would have looked like that. That's what the mid-oceanic ridge looks like on the ocean floor for the 40-some thousand miles of its entire length. Is the mantle popping up, and you would have seen the tension cracks along the ridge. Those are tension cracks as it comes up and opens up this way, and then you have perpendicular to the tension cracks of the axis of the ridge, you see one's perpendicular. And that's exactly what would have happened as it pulled itself up as it went along, coming up from being the floor of the subterranean chamber. So this is, for those that don't know what's on the ocean floor, that is one 40-some thousand mile long mid-oceanic ridge that's continually tied together when you have it on a globe. It goes over here. And very hard to explain other than what Dr. Brown believes is the source of that ridge. It's a result of Noah's flood. But this is what's so important, and that is that the ridge, when it lifts up, it can't create a void space like is shown in Dr. Brown's simulation. This is a mattress, a foam mattress that he crushes, but he presses in between these two ends of this little demonstration, and then he lays heavy chunks of wood on top of the mattress, and when he has these pieces on, the mattress stays down. But the mattress is like a spring, like the mantle. So he pulls off the center one, and it doesn't spring up. He pulls off two more, doesn't spring up. Pull off two more, and it pops up, just like the ridge does. Does everybody follow that? But when it pops up, his demonstration makes a void underneath. When the ridge of the Atlantic popped up, it can't leave a void. There's tremendous pressure deep inside the earth. So what has to happen? As it's moving up, something has to come and take that place. So the inner earth is starting to move towards that rising mid-Atlantic ridge. They call the entire 40-some thousand mile ridge the mid-oceanic ridge. But the one in the Atlantic is the one that grew first and grew the most. And it was from that everything moved away from. But it was growing all over the earth. So for this ridge to be lifted up here in the Atlantic, something had to move into its place. And what moved into its place is the inner earth. When you move rock, mantle material in the inner earth under tens of thousands of pounds per square inch, hundreds of thousands of pounds per square inch when you get deep enough, what's going to happen? You're going to create massive frictional heat. You're going to melt the rock. As the rock's moving, it's going to instantly just melt. And this is really key, because when rock melts below 400 miles in the earth, it shrinks in its volume. It increases in its density. And this is going to be very important. And I know we're talking scientific terms, and if you never signed up for physics or chemistry, you're going to say, what's density, what's volume? And I'm sorry, we lost you, and we're going to try and get you back. But the inner Earth is getting smaller. Just understand that. The inner Earth is melting below 400 miles and gets smaller, which creates further instabilities in our Earth. So what happened is that you have collapsing on the other side of the Earth, on the Western Pacific, you have a Pacific plate. There used to be a continent where the Western Pacific is right now. But its foundation was undermined by the melting of the inner Earth, and it sank down many miles down. And when it sank down, that caused the Atlantic to rise even further and allowed the Americas to move to the west, Europe, Asia, and Africa to move to the east away from the rising floor, and everything's coming crashing at the Pacific. I know this is complicated, but rising Atlantic, so America and South America want to move away from the Atlantic to the west. Asia, Africa want to move away from the mid-Atlantic ridge rising, they want to move to the east, and where do they come crashing? Pacific. Everything comes crashing around to the Pacific side. Again, this is looking at the Earth with the solid inner core, a liquid outer core, a mantle, a crust, and that little dashed line is how, this is to scale. This is showing the scale of how deep into the mantle is that crossover depth. And I'm going to emphasize this with an analogy. For those that have ever gone diving, I know there's a diver here, even if you haven't, you'd be able to handle this concept. You take a plastic milk bottle and you empty it, no more milk, it's all air, and you put the lid on it and you tie a rock to it. And you dive down and you go into the water, deeper and deeper, higher and higher pressure. That higher and higher pressure of the water will start to compress the air inside of the milk bottle. And the milk bottle's volume will get less, and the density of the air inside will get higher. Does everybody follow that so far? This is really important. There is a depth that if the diver lets go of the milk bottle, that milk bottle with the weight that's hanging to it will be exactly neutral buoyancy, and it'll just stay right there. Does everybody follow that? If the diver goes a little bit shallower, goes back up, and he lets go of the milk bottle, what happens? It's going to rise to the surface, and it's going to actually rise faster and faster as it gets closer and closer to the surface. If he's at that exact neutral buoyancy and he decides to go down from there, what's going to happen when he lets go of the bottle? It's going to go down, and the deeper it goes, it's going to go faster and faster and faster. The exact same thing happens inside our Earth when rock melts. At 400 miles deep, when rock melts, 400 miles. I keep doing that. At 400 miles, when a rock frictional heat from some deep earthquake, and there are earthquakes that are that deep. One happened in Spain a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago or so. When rock melts at 400 miles deep, the volume and density of the rock turning to liquid when it melted changes nothing. Volume is the same, density is the same. As soon as you go a little bit lower and you melt rock, the rock actually now takes less room, less volume, more density, and now something else has to fill the place because it's now shrunk. Does everybody follow that? Okay, very, very important. So when rock melts above the crossover depth, its magma is trying to find some volcano or some other way to get up shallower. When rock melts below that, it's trying to get to the liquid outer core. Any further cracking or fissures that open, that want to any slipping, that liquid magma now is denser than the rock around it, and it's trying to get deeper and deeper and deeper. Its density is greater than the rock around it. It cannot go up. What evolutionists teach about this circulating currents is like believing that an axe head can surface all of a sudden on the water that's sunk because somebody throws an axe head into the water, which we know is a miracle, and God can do that. But the evolutionists, they believe in a miracle. They believe a miracle has caused the mantle to circulate because by the laws of physics and science, their little fairy tale needs a miracle. It's not scientific. So, and they accuse us of, being brain dead. But, okay, this is the graph. And this is a graph out of a scientific paper of the Japanese that discovered this crossover depth pressure. And just by way of understanding it, this is the density when rock melts. This is the magma line. Magma means melted rock. So this line is the deeper you go. And when you go up, it's the shallower you go. And when you move to the right, you're increasing in density. When you move to the left, you're decreasing in density. So you can see that when rock melts here, it's less than the density of solid rock there. So it wants to float up. Does everybody follow that? But you can see that as you get deeper and deeper and deeper, liquid rock starts to approach the same density as solid rock. Does everybody see that? And then those two lines cross right here, and that's the crossover depth. Does everybody see that? And then when you get to the interface, and this is going to be important in a graph I'm going to show in a minute, but the liquid outer core, which anything that melts down here, rock which melts below this depth will become more dense and move towards the outer liquid. It's going to go down, and right here, this is solid rock, mantle, and right there is liquid outer core. Do you see the density difference? 5.5 and 10. So in other words, a rock right at that depth, at the depth of where it goes from being solid rock to melting to become liquid outer core, its volume shrinks by half. That's huge. That's a huge difference. And that shrinking in half has now undermined the foundation of everything above it. It's creating a stress in all the mantle and crust above it because you've just taken away some of the foundation of everything that is above the place where that rock melted. Any melting of rock below this depth results in the undermining of the mantle and crust foundation. This is the reason why there will be massive and global earthquakes in the future. And let me play this out. There are deep earthquakes. Every single deep earthquake is melting rock, which is causing greater stresses on all the remaining crust and mantle. So the stresses are increasing all over the world. You can have a deep earthquake in Spain, and it's putting stress in America underneath our foundation because it's a sphere that's losing the foundations on the inside. And so then, now there's more stress. The strength of the rock, if the strength of the rock can take the stress that solid rock was holding before it became liquid can't take stress. Okay, so solid rock is holding stress. As soon as it melts, it's no longer holding any stress. It has to give the stress it was holding to the surrounding rock. If the surrounding rock was almost ready to break before the earthquake happened, then it takes that extra little stress and it says, that's more than I can handle too. It melts. It faults and it melts. So now it's not holding anything and it has to take the stress it had and pass it on to the rock next to it, but it's saying, now you just overloaded me. Does everybody see the problem with that? It's technically what happened to the trade towers, and I'm going to assume that we didn't purposely drop them through thermal burning, but when you heat up the steel of a building, if that's what happened, if you heat up the steel of the building, ultimately hot steel can't hold as much as room temperature steel. And so then it can't hold, so a beam finally gets so hot it can't take the stress, puts it to the other beams, they're already hot too, the whole thing comes down. So for those that are into the conspiracy theory of the trade towers, then you're saying, oh, Kevin, you don't know the facts. I've heard them, I just don't know what really happened, but I know that if you heat up a structure and it can't hold it, it's going to fall. And getting back to the Earth, the scientific fact associated with increasing density of melted rock magma below the crossover depth makes the National Geographic article a glossy tabloid fantasy. It sure looks nice, though. It is glossy. They did a great job with the picture. It's just not possible. The inner Earth resulted in the collapse of the supporting rock under the Pacific Plate and the formation of the trenches. The scientific evidence that's on the Pacific floor says that this happened. A massive melting occurred and a massive block faulting of the mantle and crustal material happened. And Dr. Brown has calculated by just looking at how big the liquid outer core is. And if you assumed all that liquid outer core at one time was solid mantle that now has melted and shrunk. Let's say that 10% of that melting and the associated volume decrease, density increase, 10% of it happened before the continent started moving like we saw in the video. Then the entire Pacific would have dropped 18 miles to take that much volume. He's not saying 10% did melt. He just said, let's assume 10% of that volume difference happened before the continent started moving, and then apply that volume to the entire Pacific basin, it would have dropped 18 miles. That's just to get a feel for how big of a change in volume this melting of the inner Earth is. And now we're going to show another animation that George Hess did many years ago. And this is just showing the rising ridge in the Atlantic causing the granite plates to move. And now think about this. The rising ridge in the Atlantic is melting the inner Earth, allowing the Pacific to actually collapse and fall, making a downward, an upper, lifting the plate up on one side, lowering the plate on the other side, and off we go. It's truly like having a train on a track, and you just lift one side, drop the other side, train's going to go on the track, lubricated by the water underneath. And this is just an animation showing plates moving, and obviously when any frictional obstruction comes, you're going to be melting, and he doesn't show the melting and everything, but that kind of a collision happened on the Pacific side, and there would have been massive melting underneath the crust. The damage that would have been done, in the crust and the mantle area would have made massive amounts of magma, which is underneath Mount Rainier, other places. In fact, the next slide shows that, I'm going to tell you before you see this, for those that remember the Denali earthquake in November 2002, remember that? In Alaska, not the one that we had in 2001, but the Denali earthquake in Alaska. How many people knew that big earthquake in Alaska shook houseboats off of their sewer lines and mooring lines in Lake Union? Okay? And you're going to see the news, you're going to see the nightly news that night that I watched, and then we worked out with the Como TV to get a clip of this for educational purposes, so we got the rights to do this, to show you what happened in the nightly broadcast of the earthquake in Alaska, which is not very close to Lake Union.
And it was just going kabam, kabam, kabam.
That's one of the eyewitness accounts on Lake Union, where houseboats suddenly rocked so violently that water and sewage lines snapped in two.
So the whole thing shifted, actually quite a bit of distance.
Floating homes were rocking differently than any of these homeowners ever witnessed before.
Not this up and down
Right,
you would get
usually
if a
you go
boat
like
came
this.
through here. And so we just didn't, it was very disorienting. And then we realized that it was the water going this way.
And seismologists say they could blame the Alaska quake. While it didn't generate a tsunami, energy waves traveling through water could indeed slosh Lake Union.
You do get this very low frequency motion, very slow up and down, and that can cause bodies of water to sort of slosh, a little bit like in a bathtub.
Seismologists say there are similar reports from Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans and from nuclear power plants as far away as Minnesota. where tonight they're asking the same questions heard on Lake Union.
And then looked out to say, what is happening here?
Okay, now, the seismologists are pretty amazing. The earthquake waves could go through water. Well, it only happened in Lake Union. There's hundreds of lakes between here and Denali, Alaska that nobody was reporting. Nobody talked about the hundreds of lakes and bodies of water between Denali, Alaska and thousands of miles away in Lake Pontchartrain. I talked to somebody who was an eyewitness at Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans. He said Lake Pontchartrain all of a sudden looked like a bathtub that somebody had taken and just shook. Snapped 1-inch mooring lines on boats. And so if it's just the earthquake waves flowing through the land that hits Lake Union, then it would have been everything between Alaska and Lake Union. And for those that are familiar with physics, the energy associated with an earthquake in Alaska diminishes by the cube of the distance. So in other words, how did we have the energy to knock houseboats off hundreds and hundreds of miles away from Alaska? There should have been houseboats, everything else going all over the place. But as far as Missouri, Yellowstone's geysers were affected, Lake Pontchartrain was shaken, and so what's the explanation? The explanation is hydraulics. Underneath the continents, the continental crust, is melted magma and water left over from the way God created the earth. The water is left over from how God created the earth with some water underneath that not all of it jettisoned out. And by the magma of the compression event of the crust coming to a screeching halt underneath. So what happened in Alaska with that big earthquake is that's like pushing down the brake on your car. And then the hydraulics are going underneath the continent looking for weak places. One of the weak places is Lake Union. For those of you that have houseboats and other buildings in Lake Union, I would say based on this, you should leave, because the next really big earthquake could just pop the brake cylinders and blow the land right out, and it could just be a horrible disaster on Lake Union. Because it pressed, the hydraulics were pushing on Lake Union, and Lake Union was weak enough to actually move and shake houseboats. And Lake Pontchartrain was weak enough to shake houseboats. Does everybody follow the thought, I hope? So, this just gets a feel of the distance. See, this is the earthquake from Alaska all the way to New Orleans, thousands of miles away. Eyewitness account to me told me he couldn't believe it. Nobody could believe it. All of a sudden, it's like, at the time, they didn't know the Alaska earthquake. They were just, wow, what happened to the lake? Somebody just shook it up. So, the crossover depth is about 400 miles deep. It's really important. The center of the trenches, which are the deepest places in the Pacific Ocean, are exactly opposite of the rising Atlantic ridge. In other words, when the Atlantic rose, it pulled away the foundation on the Pacific side, and parts of the crust crushed down into the trenches on the Pacific side. There's no trenches over on the Atlantic side. All the trenches are in the Pacific. The center of them are exactly opposite the Atlantic ridge. Plus, as the foundation was removed from underneath the Pacific and block faulting would have occurred on the crust, magma would have been created. That magma would have been pouring out onto the surface. There are 40,000 volcanoes on the Pacific Ocean floor. There's not thousands of volcanoes on the Atlantic floor or any. This is the concentration, the highest concentration, far exceeding anything else found on any part of the ocean floor. And the concentration of volcanoes in the Pacific floor on the ocean side of the trenches is completely contrary to evolutionary plate tectonic theory. And this is the graph that I wanted to show you. This is a scientific fact. Over here you'll see the depth column, and this is 2,800 miles down into the earth. The interface between, this is the very bottom of the solid mantle, this is the very top of the liquid outer core. 3,000 miles deep is the very top of the liquid outer core, and you see the density is 5.5 in the rock, and just below the rock in the liquid outer core it goes to 10.1. That's a fact based on earthquake sound waves. They know the density very accurately. They know that at that interface there's that big of a density difference. That's a huge deal. So, based on the theory, the inner earth before the flood didn't have a liquid outer core, it just had an inner earth, mantle material with a crust that was around it. And you'll notice I deliberately made this earth bigger than this earth, because the earth was bigger in radius, circumference. And after the flood, the inner solid core and the source of Earth's magnetic field was formed. The liquid outer core, which is a result of the melting of the inner Earth, was formed. And see, these are fault lines that have occurred in the mantle and in the crust as a result of something has to fault as the Earth is getting smaller. So everybody see, if you have a ball this big and you're going to make it this big, something has to fault and to keep on collapsing down on top of its ever shrinking size. Which, by the way, what does that make the Earth do? Spin faster or slower? It spins faster. So that will cause the Earth to have more days in a year or less days in a year? More days in a year. Why were all the calendars of antiquity based on how many days a year? 360 days. And see, that's because before the flood, okay, they had it all figured out. 360 days, all the calendars. When the flood's over and Noah comes out of his boat, God hasn't told him, the melting of the inner earth has just sped the earth up because the volume has decreased, and therefore you need to readjust your thinking. They stuck with 360 until they realized everything's out of whack with 360. A few years go by. Wait a second, I'm having to plant my crops different every year because it's not 360 days. And so they went through, if you look in antiquity, there is so much evidence in antiquity that people struggled with the change of the calendar, which was a result of the change of the inner earth shrinking us. Every single major earthquake causes the earth to spin faster. It's a fact today. And you would expect it because every major earthquake is causing melting. The earth is continuing to get smaller and it's spinning faster. The effects of a decreasing inner earth volume can be demonstrated by removing the foundation of air pressure from the inside of a toilet bowl float. And for that demonstration, I bought one of these today. This is your earth before the flood, and it's probably apropos. It's pretty corrupt earth. This is the toilet bowl float. So if it's not totally spherical like an earth, but it's close enough for our little demonstration. So if I remove the foundation of air inside, what we did is we put some steam inside this ball, and there's no air in there. So as this thing cools down, it's losing air pressure inside the ball. It's losing its foundation that was holding the ball round, because you think the inside of that was hollow, but it wasn't. This is your earth on judgment. Okay? Now, if we could put a microphone, oh, it's making some noises. You know what those are? Earthquakes. If we had it totally solid, it would be faulting. And if you had it solid like a sphere, it would be faulting in 45-degree angles, angled down in the different layers that were there, and it would actually make it look like a plate was subducting. It'd make it look like it's going underneath against a fault boundary, like it's diving down into the earth. It's not diving down into the earth, it's just having to get a smaller and smaller internal volume. Did this properly visually make it clear? It's not going to shrink that much, the earth. If it did, we would all be flooded because the water is going to be sitting on top. And that's another thing. As the earth experiences in the future further additional massive melting on the inside, the earth's going to get smaller, the same amount of water is on the outside. What's going to happen? It's going to flood more. The Bible says the islands are going to go away. Every mountain is going to be moved. There's going to be major upheavals in the crustal effects of the earth. The crustal elevations are going to change. And so this is a scientific fact that there are these what they call Benioff zones. They know that there's a fault next to, through the mantle deep. They say it's a subducting plate. Dr. Brown would say it's a fault associated with the mantle and crust having to compress down on an ever smaller inner Earth. This gives the appearance of subducting plates, but they are not subducting as evolutionists describe. So the Atlantic Ridge raised first as the continents moved towards the Pacific, which was subsiding due to the melting of the inner Earth, and it decided to subside there first. And this is a map generated by the United States Geological Surveys associated with, and it's actually JPL NASA. So this is not a Christian map. These are the GPS people, global positioning satellite sensors all over the Earth measuring the movement of continents. And you'll notice that everything is moving towards the Pacific. All these arrows, the length of the arrows is how far it's moving in relation to other GPS sensors and the direction of travel. These are in centimeters, so things are still crashing towards the Pacific. And this fact is not consistent with conventional plate tectonic theories. This actual observed movement of the plates of the Earth is not consistent with what the evolutionist plate tectonic model shows, but it is perfectly consistent with Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory. This is a secular news article. Chile earthquake may have shortened days on the Earth. And it did shorten days on the Earth. They were thinking it did shorten it. And it also said that it moved the Earth's axis by 3 inches because of a movement of the Earth's crust. If you rearrange the mass on a spinning sphere, that sphere will roll. And so the Earth rolled 3 inches. That's because South America moved 10 feet. I think last week I said 15 feet. I forgot. It's 10 feet to the west. These are GPS coordinates. These arrows are how far and in what direction South America moved during the recent Chile earthquake. 10 feet. And as a result of the true source of earthquakes, in the future, there's going to be more of this. Now, the first time I saw this picture, I thought this was a building that was built horizontal like this, and it just split in the middle. So that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-story building was standing vertical, and in the Chile earthquake, the ground movement and shaking by all of a sudden just moving 10 feet in one direction, took that entire building and just rolled it over and then broke its back on the parking lot. And that must have, this probably was a parking area. Dr. Brown's theory explains why 80% of all earthquake activity takes place around the Pacific Rim. This is where everything came to a crashing halt. And that's why there's still instabilities. It also explains why there will be increasing earthquake activity where it is not normally seen or expected. So right now, I've been watching this map a long time, and you see there's hardly ever any earthquake activity here. I mean, like, never. But see, as the inner Earth melts and shrinks, there's going to be the stresses put on the top, and who knows what's going to let loose. There's going to be places that there's going to be faults developed that weren't there before, because that is now experiencing the greatest stress and lets loose and causes an earthquake. And what did a very reliable source say? Jesus. He said, "For nation will rise against nation in the future, in the last days, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places." And when they start popping all over the place, and one earthquake causes a whole slurry chain of events, earthquakes, and places that haven't been seeing earthquake activity for decades and centuries that people said never going to happen here because it doesn't go along with what we would consider to be a fault zone. by plate tectonics, and they start seeing all that happen, they're going to realize we've got something wrong because they didn't know what the true source of earthquakes was. Conclusion: the evolutionary plate tectonic theory is inconsistent with biblical prophecy and science, and it's taught in every classroom in America as fact. Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory explanation for the inner earth is consistent with biblical prophecy and consistent with science. Perfectly consistent with science and physics. And it says in Peter, 2 Peter 2:5, "And God did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly." That's what happened 5,000 years ago. And then it says, and only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And they had to do that by faith. By faith, God said, you know what? This place is wicked. Noah says, yeah, I know. And I'm going to destroy the place. Okay, what do? I want you to build a boat. I want you to get inside. I'm going to shut the door. If you believe me by faith, you'll live. You reject it, you'll die. And it says that he was a preacher of righteousness. That means he told everybody that wanted, that was around, he was preaching, God's judgment's coming, you need to get on the boat. And I'm sure, I wasn't there, I can assume human nature hasn't changed over the centuries, probably not over the millennia. He would have been laughed to scorn. The Bible also says the same place in Peter, "But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men." When these future massive earthquakes occur and faults are opened up into magma pools that are created during the flood, there will be cataclysmic events happening on this earth, this time fire, rather than water and flood. And Jesus told us it would be so, and it's another thing that's consistent with the hydroplate theory. All that magma and stuff is ready for Judgment Day, coming on the earth. Are you on the ark? What's the ark today? The ark is Jesus. And the world wants to laugh us to scorn. Oh, we're going to solve our problems. We're going to drill for oil. Isn't it funny how people that solve problems? And I mean, I'm all for it too, but it just shows you. Did you know that one report is that the BP executives flew out to the oil well to celebrate their safety record of having just successfully completed the drilling of the well that was in the final stages of being made ready for production. And they're sipping suds and high-fiving, aren't we good? Just like the Titanic. In fact, I wonder, as I grow older and I see the effects of man's pride, I kind of wonder, what would I have done if I had a all-expense paid trip to New York on the maiden voyage of the Titanic, and I was walking on the pier, and I happened to see the sign that one of the builders put on the pier saying, "God couldn't sink this ship." I hope I would have been spiritual enough to say, anybody want my ticket? Because the pride of man is incredible. And see, either we have Jesus, and he is our Savior, and we are trusting on him, and we are standing on the rock, or you're trusting in man to solve man's problems, when everything that we look at is everything man touches turns to disaster. Everything man promises, God couldn't sink this ship, nobody's going to mess with our oil wells, nobody's going to this, everything just shows the frailty and the inability of man to do what they hope to do. I would rather put my hope and trust in the God who created the universe than to put my hope and trust in man. And so, if the answer to "Are you on the ark, Jesus?" is yes, then you are saved. And though we might experience an earthquake in Kitsap County or Mason County tomorrow that could collapse all the buildings, and what do we have a hope of if all of a sudden the building comes down on us and knocks us on the head? We're going to go be with Jesus. We have a hope. So I don't want this to scare anybody and say, oh no, what are we going to do? Global earthquakes. I hope you're scared really bad if you don't know Jesus, if you're not on the ark. And I hope you do something about finding Jesus, because he is our rock spiritually, and nothing will move him. The earthquakes are coming, and they're going to be bad, but nothing is going to touch our soul being saved by Jesus, and we have an inheritance in heaven.
And sing of his glory.